Good evening and welcome to the webinar on achieving net zero emissions in the maritime sector. I'd like to start by welcoming all of you and our esteemed panelists this evening. I will begin by introducing the ladies on the panel. Start with Michelle. Michelle is a partner at Oxera Consulting, LLP, leading the transport team. Michelle works across aviation, ports, roads and rail, helping companies, investors, policymakers and regulators around the world on issues such as market design, competition and regulatory design. Michelle also plays a leading role in Oxera's climate economics practice, helping clients consider the impact of different climate policies on their business and using economics to help find solutions in collaboration with clients. Oxera presented at COP26 about the economics of climate change during one of the World Leaders' Days and held a number of events, including one on decarbonization of transport during the summit. Welcome, Michelle. Our next panelist is Suyin. Suyin Anand is currently the Commodities Manager for Freight at Australian Mining House South 32, where she is accountable for both the chartering and operations desk. She's also the co-founder of Maritime Pitch Challenge, Captain's Table, a platform developed to power the future of maritime through connecting innovators in the startup space. She was the youngest Asian woman to be partner of a leading international maritime firm, and though she underplays it, we're very, very proud that she was also the top 10 maritime lawyers by Lord's List. Welcome, Suyin. Next on the panel is Mr. Eng Kyong Ko. With 22 years of experience in business development and account management, research and product development, and in the technology business. Mr. Ko's background is an environmental engineer. He's had a variety of assignments spanning industries from specialty chemical, environment to maritime clean energy. He has intimate knowledge of the workings of the R&D business and the triple helix working experience in the industry, government, and academic institutions. Mr. Ko's research includes decarbonization of the maritime sector and technology commercialization. He has helped to develop impactful projects at GCMD to accelerate the implementation of decarbonizing maritime solutions. Previously, he was the Assistant Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Maritime Energy and Sustainable Development Center at Nanyang Technological University. He managed the operations and chartered the strategic research roadmap and partnerships, successfully delivering key projects and outcomes in advancing the knowledge of low-carbon alternative energy landscapes for maritime Singapore. Welcome, sir. We next have Mr. Toby Menzies, Director of Business Development at Core Power UK Limited. Mr. Menzies serves as the Director of Business Development for Core Power, a UK-based development company that specializes in scalable atomic power technology for ocean transport and heavy industry, and is in partnership with several leading international corporations. He's an experienced shipping, offshore, and energy professional with over 22 years of experience in the field of international shipping, maritime, and brokerage. He's also now working towards promoting advanced atomic technology to decarbonize transport and industry. Welcome, Toby. Finally, we have Shreyas Jayasama, founding partner at Aarna Law, who brings more than 20 years of experience in litigation, domestic, and international disputes. He advises and represents clients across industry and provides advisory and opinions to corporations on diverse issues. He's also been appointed as an arbitrator in India and internationally sat as an arbitrator on various matters. Shreyas's practice, Aarna Law, has emerged as the law firm of preference for many shipping companies in dealing with maritime issues. The firm advises and represents cargo owners and purchasers in shipping and maritime claims. It also assists and advises companies on, on contentious and non-contentious matters such as insurance of of ship owners, port authorities, and shipyards. The firm has been involved in international maritime arbitrations. We welcome everybody on the panel as well as our guests. We'd like to start by looking at why is it that today we're talking about decarbonization of the maritime sector. According to an October 2019 report by the World Bank, the world will need to make significant changes to the way we are functioning. COVID-19 and global warming today, which is really not a figment of our imagination, but something that we've all experienced and seen for ourselves in each of the countries we live in, cities we live in, the impact that climate change is making. There is going to be significant investment in infrastructure over the next 15 to 20 years. The report of the World Bank says investments of up to $90 trillion will be needed between now and 2030. But unless this investment is sustainable, there is going to be a global catastrophe. Transition to a green economy is something that can be done because we have the technology, but we have to unlock new economic opportunities to meld this technology and make it sustainable. Transition to a green economy is possible if we look at monetary values. The same report clearly says that an investment of $1 made today on an average would yield a benefit of approximately $4 in the long run were we to use green technology. So I'd like to begin by asking Michelle to share with us a brief gist of what transpired at COP26 with respect to the need for industry to look at emissions with a special focus on the maritime industry.
So as you mentioned in the introduction, we at Oxera were at that COP, and with it finishing just less than 2 weeks ago, we thought it was a useful time and a useful opening to the webinar today to pause and take stock about what was and wasn't achieved and also what might lie ahead going forward. So if we think firstly more broadly about COP across the transport sector, it really set out a vision where every car, bus or truck on the road is electric and affordable, and shipping vessels and planes only use sustainable fuels. But I think the question is, how close did we get to commitments and tangible actions that will actually help us achieve that vision? And if we look first kind of more broadly across the transport sector, there was some progress made. So there were more than 100 national governments, cities, and some major car companies that signed a declaration on zero emission cars and vans to get rid of internal combustion engines in leading markets by 2035 and globally by 2040. And in aviation, we had 80 signatories committed to boost green fuel to 10% of global jet fuel demand by 2030. But one of the really big questions leading into the summit was what could be achieved in the maritime sector, which is a notoriously hard to abate sector, and one where zero carbon infrastructure currently doesn't exist at scale. And at the same time, a sector which accounts for somewhere between 2 and 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's also important to remember the maritime sector was going into this against a context where there have been increases in greenhouse gas emissions according to recent IMO reports in the last few years, and also where the most recent target set by the IMO is a 50% reduction by 2050, which is, slightly contrary to some other sectors, especially in transport, where there's net zero targets by 2050. So it's perhaps that context which then led to a number of bold commitments being made as part of COP in the maritime sector. So the first one was actually one that happened in advance of the summit, and this was the call to action developed by the Getting to Zero Coalition, and this was submitted just ahead of COP. And it was signed by more than 200 companies, organizations across the entire value chain of in terms of shipping, finance, ports, and fuel production, pledging to work with the IMO to pursue the goal of zero emission shipping by 2050. And tangible goals were established. So for example, reaching at least 5% zero emission fuels in international shipping by 2030 and having commercially viable zero emission vessels operating on deep sea trade routes. The second commitment then really led on from that call to action, and this was the Declaration on Zero Emission Shipping by 2050. And this declaration was signed by 14 countries, including major players such as the US, the UK, Germany, Norway, Panama, and focuses on immediate reductions in emissions in shipping in the 2020s with the goal of reaching zero emission by 2050. And their goal is really to create this kind of tipping point in 2030. So working over the next 10 years so that by 2030, there's really a tipping point towards full decarbonization of the sector. But perhaps the most noteworthy achievement in terms of maritime at COP was the Clydebank Declaration, which established green shipping corridors. And as part of this, there were 22 signatories, including countries such as Japan, the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And they committed themselves to develop technology, expertise, and port infrastructure that will allow key international shipping routes to go zero carbon as part of a strategy to decarbonize the industry by 2050. So tangibly, they agreed to establish 6 green corridors by 2025, with 2 initial candidates floated. One was the iron ore route between Australia and Japan, and another was the container shipping route between Asia and Europe. The latter chosen because it is responsible for the most greenhouse gas emissions of any route. And the goal is that there will be these green shipping corridors using fuels derived from green hydrogen, renewable electricity, or other sustainable sources. So really a significant achievement, although at the same time, the decentralized nature of the agreement means that it will be reliant on bilateral partnerships between individual countries at the end of the routes to come together and really make this happen. So I would say, just to sum up, in terms of COP, probably a bit more ambition and tangible commitments across the entire value chain and governments and companies than perhaps we've seen at previous COPs for sure, and particularly in terms of more on the net zero initiatives by 2050, which perhaps surpasses some previous targets that were talked about in the industry.
I think what's amazing is that finally there is some action. I think up to Paris, people were just talking about it. But I think now, especially at COP26, there have been significant steps taken to actually put to action and say, these are the things that I'm going to do, or these are the steps that I'm going to take. And it's great to see that these 2 corridors have been identified, because at least it's a beginning. Because if it can be done in these 2 corridors, then yes, they can replicate it all over the world. So I'd like to, pose the next question to Mr. Ko, who would, Mr. Ko, would you like to share with us, in order to reach this kind of net zero ambition by 2050? Yes, there have been trials of various alternative fuels. There has been a lot of talk in industry to look at what is the option available, or what is the next best option available to them. So could you throw some light on the alternative fuels available in the industry, keeping in mind these net zero targets, which companies can begin to consider?
Okay, thank you, Kamala. When we look at the shipping industry, if it is for them to reach, say, net zero or close to zero emission by 2050, action has to start very soon, because we have to understand that shipping assets last a long time, typically 20 to 25 years. So you are talking about, if you want the majority of the shipping industry to be running on, have a low carbon emission, we are talking about the first ship that has to be built by 2025. And when you start to go down that kind of line of thoughts, right, bearing in mind that ships comes in different form, different size, and they can be as large as a floating power plant in terms of scale. And ships actually do travel around the world, refueling from point A to point B, and some with larger capacity go on round trip before they refuel. And thus, when we talk about decarbonization solutions, available fuels, we do have a few candidates that a lot of people has been talking about, and they are like the biofuels. It is a very easy solution for drop-in, and is compatible with existing heavy fuel oil and marine gas oil. And there are already ships that is running on LNG. I will term it as alternative low carbon because it is lower in carbon in terms of emission by about 20%. And in the future, of course, you can move on to bio-LNG. There are also methanol by itself. If you look at the emissions on board the ships, it is lower, but there will be further work needed to, if you start to consider the whole life cycle assessment where it comes from source. I mean, that's where people are starting to take accounting into place. And of course, what is very kind of being talked about is ammonia, a form of hydrogen carrier, as in the fuel to be to come, because it basically don't have a carbon bond. It has the highest hydrogen molecules among the lot. And but then it comes with this issue in terms of it is made predominantly around for the fertilizer and chemical industries. It is not a fuel per se. So you need to actually ramp up the quantity and also to understand whether the source is green enough. Similarly for hydrogen, which is also a molecule that you use to produce ammonia. So in terms of availability, if you start to look across the entire spectrum, based on some of the studies, typically people ask, what kind of fuel is it available today that we can use, and what can we do moving forward into the future? So some studies have indicated that if you look at the short to mid-term, like from 2020 onwards to 2030, we can look at LNG because it's available and we can actually use it as of now and slowly transit into bioenergy. Biodiesel first and second generations is also being considered now because you can actually fit into current infrastructures. And of course, we are also aware that there are vessels running on methanol fuels, fossil-based for now, like Maersk actually announced that. Of course, there'll be renewable and green methanol coming online. I mean, that's the plan. In terms of longer term, we take 2030 as the line, the time to actually transit. We will see ammonia coming on stream, biodiesel third generations, meaning that it has to be more sustainably from LNG sources or from waste, and renewable methanol that will come, and bio-LNG. So that is how we see the availability of the fuel across from now to the future. Now, I also want to stress that we cannot solely depend on alternative fuels. There are other measures like the technical measures and operational measures that's available for ships to be more efficient in terms of the technologies using fuel, and also to operate in a more energy efficient manner. So there are a lot of, I would say, measures available. And for the shipping industry to decarb, it takes a combination of a lot of factors. And in terms of solution, there will be no one solution that fits all. You really have to find which route, where actually do you do your port calls, and what are the fuels that's most suitable from the price range, because availability will be around the world and the cost of the fuel will be different around the world. So it's a very complex issue, and we have to do a lot more studies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Toby, I'd like to ask the next question to you, please. Keeping in mind the huge increase in price of freight, a huge shortage of shipping containers, and this complete freeze by companies to say, what is the next fuel? Let's figure that out before actually going ahead and placing an order for the next set of a fleet of vessels. Do you think that nuclear fuel is an answer to this question, because it's something that is available, commercializable, Could you throw some light on where the technology is, how it works, and some of the safety concerns that one should keep in mind?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I mean, I think it's a very, very short answer to your question is yes, it is part of the answer. We understand that it's not the whole answer. Atomic powered ships aren't for everyone, and it is not suitable for all sectors of the shipping market. That's clear. But it might help if I give you just a little bit of background about the technology that we're working on and how we're working on it. I mean, Core Power was founded in 2018, and in 2020 we joined a consortium of companies under the ARDP, which is the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program in the United States. Now, that's a program that's sponsored by the US Department of Energy. You mentioned in the introduction there about our consortium partners. They are TerraPower, which is the Seattle-based nuclear developer founded by Bill Gates and some others in 2006. The other large company in the consortium is Southern Company, which is a major utilities player in the States. And the third one is Aarna, which is the French national nuclear fuels company. And we're the fourth company. So each has its own role. TerraPower taking the lead on the reactor design and technological development. Southern Company already operate several power stations, nuclear power stations in the States. They will emerge as the operator of the technology. Aarna obviously handle the front and back end of the fuel cycle. And our role really is maritime readiness and on the regulatory side and building a market for this technology. So we're in this program, which is sponsored by the DOE. It's sort of a public-private cost share. And I think the DOE is putting in about 140 million and the consortium is putting in about 30 to develop this proof of concept test reactor. It's called McCree, the molten chloride reactor experiment. So work started on that this summer. There's an integrated effects test that's underway at TerraPower's facility. And then the McCree building is being built at the Idaho National Laboratory in the States. So McCree will complete in around 2025. Okay, and then following that, we'll start going down the licensing path with the NRC in the States, which is the nuclear regulator. 2026 and 27 will probably see us spending a lot of time completing a full-size marine demonstrator of the reactor, because the McCree itself is quite a small reactor. It's just a proof of concept. I think it's about 400 kilowatt electric in size. So it's sort of a desktop reactor, if you like. But the marine demonstrator will be full size. It will be deployed offshore. We might see it taking some early part in some hydrogen-derived fuel production, so maybe some ammonia production in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, still to be determined, but that could happen. And then providing that proves itself, our order book will open in 2028, and we hopefully should see the first deliveries around 2030 onwards, and hopefully by 2040 we could be manufacturing several hundred molten chloride fast reactors per year. So I accept it's quite a long time to commercialization. We're in the pre-commercialization phase at the moment, but atomic technology takes as long as it takes to develop. It's not something that will happen overnight, and we're not ready to deploy this year or next. But one thing we should say is that this development program that we're in with our consortium partners is fully funded and is going full steam ahead. So we're very excited about that. I think the second part of your question was relating to the safety reasons, and it's clear that most of what people consider the disadvantages that are associated with nuclear propulsion are largely removed when you use this molten salt reactor, which is the type of fourth generation advanced atomic technology that we're developing. With the molten salt reactor, you have no need for any high pressure containment system, which makes the reactor cheaper. You have no refueling during the life of the reactor, which is the same as the life of the ship. So that reduces risk. And there's really a minimal waste from this reactor compared to conventional reactors, which makes it a very sort of sustainable solution. But just looking at sort of some of the safety points in more detail, because it's obviously a key point, right? We're not going to get anywhere getting reactors on board ships if we can't properly address and tackle all the safety issues. There are really two very important differences with a molten salt reactor compared to conventional nuclear. And the first one is the composition of the fuel and the coolant. And the second one is the system pressure. So if we take the fuel and the coolant first, these two elements are actually fused together. The fuel is locked inside the coolant, so they become one. It's a molten liquid above 400 degrees. So there's never any possibility that you could have a loss of the coolant on its own. If you lose the coolant, you also lose the fuel, and you then lose reactivity. So it has an automatic shutdown mechanism in that way. And then the second big difference is this system pressure. The system runs at ambient pressure. Because we're not using water as the coolant anymore, we don't have to have water kept under high pressure to stop it turning to steam at too low temperatures. So the system can't melt down and it can't explode. It's not possible for it to expel anything outside of the reactor itself. So, whilst we must recognize that ships will always have accidents, it's an unfortunate fact of life. The reason that the molten salt reactor has been chosen ahead of hundreds of other reactor designs is precisely because it does so well in these adverse maritime scenarios. I mean, I think you can consider that shipping accidents come in various different levels of severity. We can all remember the Ever Given incident in the Suez Canal back in March of this year as a soft grounding incident, let's say. If that vessel had been powered by a molten salt reactor, it's quite possible to idle the reactor down to very low levels, standby levels, if you like. Then after the ship has been salvaged and given the all clear to proceed, you can ramp up the reactor again and get on your way. A mid-level accident, something more serious, a sort of a collision or something hard grounding, something like that, you can actually drain the reactor core down, so you can release the fuel salts from the core into a series of drain tanks below the reactor, and that's when they would start to solidify as the temperature drops and they would become like a rock. They can't go anywhere, they can't escape. Again, when the ship is salvaged, if it's salvaged and can be deployed again, the reactor can be restarted. Simple as that. And then there's sort of a third level of severity. If there was a catastrophic incident, a capsize, something like that, you could either drain the reactor down in the same way, or there is a sort of final failsafe of a poison pill, effectively, which you would be dropped into the reactor and would immediately sort of kill it off. That would be a sort of a final resort action, because you can't restart the reactor from that point. So I hope that gives you a bit of background into what we're doing and the timelines and some of the safety aspects.
Lovely, thank you. Can you also throw some light on what happens to the method of radioactive waste disposal? Because you said that the fuel would last as long as the vessel. And so ultimately, when the vessel had to go and be salvaged, what were the steps that or regulatory frameworks that one need to keep in mind from perspective of disposal of the radioactive waste?
Yeah, I mean, I think radioactive waste is sort of more of an ideological issue rather than a technological one. Let's say that the industry is very, very good at managing its waste, or I should really refer to it as spent fuel management, really, because if we go back to this concept of conventional reactors operating on land, there you have fuel in a solid form. They are small pellets of uranium fuel. They're arranged in assemblies, often in hexagonal form, and they go into the reactor core in that fashion. The assemblies can be rearranged during the fuel cycle, but inevitably after 18 months or 2 years, that fuel cycle is finished and that fuel has to come out. It can't be used anymore. In actual fact, only 1% to 2% of that fuel has been used, and the rest is usable again. It's called radioactive waste, but really it's sort of a combination of spent fuel and unused fuel. So it's only really waste until you decide you're not going to use it again. It could, in fact, a lot of it could be reprocessed and used again, but the industry doesn't do that most of the time at the moment. So in that way, the unused fuel is harmless. The spent fuel is radioactive, but both of them are metals, solid metal. They can't blow or dissipate in the air, and they can't leak into the ground. And the the nuclear industry is very good at handling these metals. They tend to go into dry cask storage and is put away. Now, when we go back to the molten salt reactor, by contrast, this sort of turns the fuel cycle and the radioactive handling on its head, because it's liquid fuel and because it's the reactor operating in the fast spectrum, means it has incredible fuel efficiency. So if you took a Cape-sized vessel powered by molten salt reactor, so a large bulk carrier, after 25 years of operation, at the end of the vessel's life, it would have used about 170 kilos of its fuel load. Now it's emitted nothing during that quarter of a century. It doesn't have any smokestacks, nothing goes into the air. So this same amount of material would be effectively the spent fuel to be stored away. Now it's solid metal, it's very, very heavy. It would actually fit inside a shoebox potentially. And this sort of shoebox sized piece of metal would go into one of these dry casks. The casks are made of extremely strong shielding material. There's no radioactivity measurable on the outside of those casks, and it goes into long-term storage, and most of that radioactive decay is gone in 20 years. There are some long-lived actinides, of course, that live longer, but I think I'm right in saying that after 300 years, 97% has gone, which actually compares quite favorably with the amount of CO2 that's still left in the atmosphere, which can linger around for many thousands of years. And yes, comparing that 170 kilos of spent fuel from a Cape-sized vessel, I think that equivalent ship has burnt many millions of tons, or emitted many millions of tons of CO2 during its lifetime. I hope that addresses some of the issues on what's considered waste, but really the sort of concept of waste from these vessels powered by an MSR is actually a selling point for the technology rather than something that should detract away from it, is our view.
No, absolutely. But I think what I was alluding to is that regulatory frameworks within the countries would have to be very, very stringent on how this radioactive waste is to be handled and disposed. At least from an Indian perspective, we're seeing that a lot of radioactive material is used in medical equipment. And we're seeing that they're finding it difficult to dispose equipment once it is outdated. Say a new machine comes in, in 10 years' time, they want to get rid of the old one.
Okay.
And so again, stringent standards have to be maintained within to ensure that there's safe disposal. And I get what you're saying to say that it's very easy to do it, but we've got to make sure that they do it.
Yeah, sure. And what I would say about that is very, one of the key things for us is that because the reactor is fueled for life, it would be commissioned at the start of the vessel's life when it's a new building, and the reactor would be decommissioned and taken out before the vessel itself is then scrapped. So this would all be done. You only have two bits of operation with the reactor at the start and the end of the ship's life, and they would both happen in a dedicated facility, which sort of handles the whole cradle to grave cycle of the reactor and its fuel. So it wouldn't just be that we would, the vessel could be scrapped anywhere and it would be left to that nation to handle the reactor and its materials. That would be done, at a dedicated facility that's set up for that specific purpose.
Lovely.
It's very important for us that we don't have any handling of fresh or spent nuclear fuels in ports around the world. That's a key point. That would be a proliferation risk that would be intolerable for commercial shipping. It just wouldn't work because you can't assume that every nation would be a nuclear nation that wants to have this material in its ports. It's too difficult. So that's why we've gone for these long fuel cycles that match and calibrate with the vessel itself.
Great, lovely. Thank you so much. Michelle, may I come to you? In terms of government and industry coming together and creating and implementing this zero carbon, green shipping corridor globally, what do you think they need to do in terms of next steps?
Yeah, so I think what's clear is the transition to net zero will require industry and government to come together, and will require that across all levels of the value chain. And I think we have, good examples of that from people on the panel today talking. And we've also seen that a number of the initiatives, both at COP and before that, do have both government and industry really working alongside one another. But there's obviously some areas where policymakers will need to take an even bigger role and governments will need to take a bigger role. So, for example, if we think about the investment needed, clearly some co-investment will be needed between government and industry, given the estimates of the investment needed to get to net zero. So I think the Global Maritime Forum estimated about $2 trillion investment in global shipping fleet over the next 20, 30 years to help with decarbonization and getting to net zero. But that raises then an interesting question about whether policymakers should be supporting specific new technologies and fuels to incentivize the sufficient investment, or whether there should be more of a focus on, in a sense, ensuring technological neutrality, given we've heard today already on the panel that there's not really a clear winner in a lot of these areas in terms of fuels or technologies yet. So it's probably, rather than a dichotomy, trying to find a balance between the two in terms of how to support the necessary technologies that are not yet viable and require investment, but also leaving enough room for market forces to determine the best technologies and fuels, etc. And I think, as you alluded to earlier, Kamala, the Clyde Bank Declaration actually could give a good opportunity for that, in terms of companies can trial new technologies on certain designated corridors, and then policymakers can help create the policy or regulatory frameworks to support those technologies and fuels that are proven. But I think, importantly, there won't be a one-size-fits-all solution. There'll be different fuels, different technologies that are appropriate on different corridors and different routes. I think the other area where policymakers can play an important role is actually in terms of the interaction between different sectors as well as different parts of the value chain. So, for example, between energy and transport, I think policymakers are really well placed there to ensure that sufficient cross-sector coordination is happening to make sure that we can get to net zero in the industry.
Lovely, thank you. May I request Suyin to come in now and share with us, what, Suyin, do you think are the practical challenges in implementing this transition to alternative fuels, and keeping the real world in mind, things like cost, global standards, benchmarks involved from a ship owner's perspective?
Yes, thanks, Kamala. First off, I'd like to say I can't really comment from a ship owner's perspective, but I can comment from a shipping perspective, given I'm not a ship owner. But, the previous speakers have touched on most of the challenges, if not all the challenges. One, it's a complex issue involving multiple stakeholders, involving multiple technologies. There's no clear solution. There's no clear regulation. There's no clear framework within which corporates can proceed to understand or start problem solving for this. There's also no one size fits all at the moment. And each company will be working off different budgets. So you can't expect an owner who owns one ship or two ships to be as engaged and have the same type of resources to problem solve for this as an owner who owns 500, 600, 700 ships. I think as well, if I were to be really honest about it, as with every trend of the moment or with any sexy topic, there's a lot of information being thrown upon companies within the industry, a lot of expectations with just the demand that you do something about it. So it is challenging for companies to actually sort through everything and understand what it really means. And that's where I just want to suggest that the starting point when we consider these issues as a corporate, it's not what is the alternate fuel that I should be going on, but what corporates should be thinking about is, what does this actually mean for my organization? What is the decarbonization problem as it relates to my organization? And then proceed to understand what is the size of the problem as it relates to my organization? And where is the biggest footprint? Where does it sit? We focus a lot on emissions during a voyage, but let's not forget that you have to look at the entire supply chain. For a ship owner, what is a ship owner's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? Where is there the biggest emissions footprint? What are the low-hanging fruits that I can proceed to solve for first, whilst industry regulators catch up or make advancements on the bigger problems like alternate fuels? Who are my collaborators? When I start looking and understanding at what my scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are, like what Michelle suggested, right? More collaboration across industries. In the scope 1 and scope 2 space, when I look at my upstream, are there upstream suppliers I should be collaborating with to help make advancements in the emissions areas as it relates to my scope 1 emissions? And also, when we talk about the voyage as a ship owner or even as charterers, who are our counterparties that we should be collaborating with in order to problem solve this together? What does it mean for me? And does it mean the same thing for my counterparty, whom I'm possibly going to pass on some of the costs to? So at this stage, I really think for a corporate, it's set aside all the noise, right? Have a good understanding about what is coming our way in the long term. And I think, what has been set out and agreed at COP26 is a good start for understanding what the expectations in the longer term are. And then set out then by understanding and putting together a strategy that involves both not both, but along lines, short-term, mid-term, long-term. And in the short term, understand where the collaboration sits. And I think as Eng Kyong pointed out very early on in this afternoon session, it's not just about alternative fuels. In the short term, there are other steps that ship owners can be taking together with their stakeholders to problem solve in the areas of vessel optimization, fuel optimization, better scheduling, better planning. It's understanding all this, understanding what we can do in the short term in order to achieve the net zero emission targets that are set out there. When it comes to alternate fuel, which is what your question more specifically relates to, is also asking as a corporate, all right, with all these fuels out there, be it whether it's atomic energy, whether it's biofuels, whether it's LNG, as a corporate, in consultation, I believe, with stakeholders as well, is how are we going to start testing these different fuels as it relates to our business? And who should we be collaborating with? If it's going to be LNG, come up with a plan to test LNG. If it's biofuel, come up with a plan to test that. I think that is what is necessary in order to overcome the practical challenges, which is uncertainty, if I can sum it up that way, in relation to what is expected, how this is all going to develop. It's by taking baby steps, understanding what it means for each individual corporate.
Lovely, thank you. We also see there's a lot of greenwashing going on. When you go to an organization, they say, yes, we're doing it. These are our goals. But when you ask them in reality what they're doing, they're not being able to pinpoint and say, yes, these are the actions that we're taking. So how does one then make the organizations think about what their values are and where they want to be, and COP26 and its goals? How do we kind of, get them to kind of start thinking along these lines?
I'll start saying that, when I brought up the issue of greenwashing with a friend recently, who's more knowledgeable in this area than I am, he just looked at me and smiled and said, is it just greenwashing, or does the industry just have very low standards, such that what looks like greenwashing to the outside world or non-maritime world is actually the maritime industry achieving standards? So I think that's a good starting point, right? I think greenwashing, again, is a very trendy word to use now when someone is not able to articulate a strategy, or when perhaps, we don't like what the other person is saying and think they're not doing enough. We say, yeah, you're greenwashing. But going back to the first question, what are the standards? If the standards are low and if we're trying to shift mindsets in the industry, should we as a start applaud efforts being taken by companies to try to combat or try to make advancements in this area? perhaps, yes, it's like maybe talking to a child, learning new things for the first time. You're like, oh, correct, you've taken your first step. Well done, well done. All right, what can we do more? Secondly, then, it's really drilling down into what is actionable. And I think I'll repeat what I said earlier, because I do believe in this. Because there is no one size fits all, it's very important for organizations to take a step back and really understand what it means for them. In my view, and I'll perhaps touch on this later in this session, to me, sustainability is linked very closely to an organization's license to operate. Now, if we start from there, I think the question that we need to be asking is, what does license to operate mean to a corporate? And what are the strategies and steps that we need to take in order to maintain this license to operate? And I think that's where values comes in. And that's how we bring it all together. Is there greenwashing that goes on? Of course there is, right? I mean, you look at the media, but like I said, perhaps we are being a bit harsh on some of these initiatives. I mean, hey, you want to build an LNG ship and you've got people to back you on that. I'm like, great. At least you're making a commitment and taking action in one direction. But I don't know whether other panelists have views on greenwashing. Usually it's a very contentious issue.
Yeah, we'll try to get those answers offline post the webinar. But coming back to regulations, Shreyas, would you be able to throw some light on what the current regulatory positions on maritime decarbonization are in a composite approach towards regulating carbon emissions and decarbonization? What is the need of the hour?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you, Kamala. I'd like to draw back the attention to where we began with Michelle pointing out that the IMO has set a modest but perhaps achievable timeline of 2050 for achieving about 50% reductions in global greenhouse emissions. Now, this may not be as aggressive as the other statements that have been heard during the COP26, but that noise and enthusiasm ought not to drive away the cautious step-by-step approach that the industry leader organizations can put in place. Obviously, the other initiatives of having zero emission fleets or net zero itself being achieved by 2050 and commitments being made by some nations can certainly help and inspire other nations to act further. But I'm also speaking from the context of in which countries like India have made the point that net zero can certainly be achieved, but perhaps at a slightly longer period of time. In fact, India has made the commitment of achieving that by 2070. So when you come to the regulatory responses to achieving these objects, there are multiple milestones that commercial organizations, nation states, and corporations are issuing for themselves. So what we could foresee in the coming days would be some market-based measures. Also, of course, domestically, sovereign nations might impose either investment incentives or even taxation measures to incentivize investment and the transition from fuel oil to other more efficient technologies. And also the significant capital investment that comes in has to be considered. And please bear this in mind in the time of the great disruption that we have seen in the shipping supply chains itself. So as even the supply chains for complex projects like aircraft, like ships, there's an effort to contain the length of these supply chains. And there's an effort to shorten those supply chain lengths as well as part of the learning from what we have seen in the past few months. So the regulatory efforts would be perhaps to look at regional trade arrangements where the components can be more expeditiously provided, and then to also, as Suin and Eng Kyong have been making the point, looking at measures outside of alternate fuels per se, and looking at measures to incentivize, identify key measurements for the decarbonization of existing shipping arrangements and ensuring that those are met. I'll quickly point out to the Sea Cargo Charter that represented some of the early efforts to include clauses in charter parties which might be more environmentally focused as well. And but at the end of the day, we do need, whatever the measures are, we do need some accountability, transparency, and ultimately enforcement of those measures without being able to achieve progress.
Thank you, Shreyas. I'd like to go back to Mr. Ko to discuss what are the safety and technical standards that organizations, governments, companies should be looking at during the bunkering process in case shipping shifts to alternative fuels, say ammonia. Do you consider we need firm regulations to kind of effect this change?
Okay, I think maybe I'll take one step back. That when you ask about the question of safety and those guidelines for bunkering, I would like to stress that bunkering is the way that the shipping refuel their fuels, and I would like to also maybe highlight that unlike on the road where we go to a petrol station, in the shipping context, the petrol station goes to the ship. So from that perspective, when you look at bunkering, you need to appreciate that it is a very key piece of the entire value chain. And it will have an issue whereby, do I have a customer versus a customer to say, do I have a supply? So it has a chicken and egg conundrum to it. And when you add on the infrastructure costs and the investment cycle, and then all the other regulatory sandbox and all the issues, you will reach a situation where everyone will say, wait and see. I wait for you, you wait for me. And that's why typically you see the movement forward will be very slow in terms of energy transition. It is very organic. It takes baby steps to encourage another baby to take another steps. And slowly, then you can see, oh, okay, over the 5, 10, 20 years, that's where people say, okay, look, there's enough on the table. We have enough experience, like what Suin said. To speed up, let's do pilot, let's do demonstration. Lesson learned 1, lesson learned 2, lesson learned 3 from different perspectives. Everything add up, we have a standard. It's of a sufficient low risk where investment will come in to say, yes, I'm ready to invest into the sectors. And that's where money will start to come in, and you see the transition actually kind of pick up pace. So when you mention ammonia, it's very interesting because if you based on what I just shared with you, right? Ammonia is not on the short-term list. It's quite far away. But why are people actually talking ammonia? Precisely because it takes a very long time to actually make the transition. And ammonia is interesting because it is kind of appear to be the running, the one leading candidate. And it is a very unusual fuel in the sense that it is toxic, not those that really is very flammable and explosive, even though it is, but toxicity comes for that. So you have to imagine an industry of seafarer trying to say that today I'm going to handle a fuel that it is actually very toxic. The type of training, the type of certification, the type of expectation, the type of machineries, everything has to follow a chemical industry standard, but you got to operate as a fuel. So it becomes very complex, and ammonia itself has a different state. It can exist as a liquid and as a gas, depending on how you want to handle it. And it becomes more complicated because of that, unlike the traditional fuel, which is maybe one state, like the heavy fuel oil, and the cryogenic is like, I know it's cold and it is liquid. Ammonia can exist in different states, depending on the pressure and temperature. So we, GCMD itself, our role as what kind of implied in other panelists have said, we want to eliminate GHG emission by shaping standard, deploying solution, financing projects, and fostering collaboration across the sector. So on ammonia piece of work recently, in October, we actually called for invitation for proposal to conduct a feasibility study to define the safety and operation envelope for ammonia bunkering in order for us to do a pilot and demonstration, which we anticipate to come in 2024, 2025, when the machineries and the first ships with engines, everything will be ready. So our job is very much to try to accelerate the whole decarbonization process by riding the waves. This is as fast as we can go, and we want to go faster, yes, but we need to work with a lot of people. And that's where, when you ask me the question on the safety and operation envelopes, right, it has a lot of parameters in it. It has a lot of consideration in it. I haven't even talked about the engagement with the regulators, which is also needed because we need to have a regulatory sandbox for us to conduct it. So it's location specific also. So by saying all this, I hope to give you a flavor that we're trying to solve a very complex issue. And that's what GCMG is trying to do. And we're trying to get a group of really dedicated experts to kind of try to crack the problem where it really matters. So I hope that helps the panelists to think about how and why we're trying to solve this problem in a very laser-focused approach. Thank you.
No, thank you for that perspective, and thank you to the GC MD for kind of thinking about these aspects and hopefully putting out some white papers or some policy papers, because governments are at a loose end, private entities are at a loose end. I think if there is some thought leadership, then that will kind of steer both government as well as private enterprise to kind of figure out what are the issues and what are the kind of frameworks and regulatory issues that they need to contemplate on before actually going ahead and commercializing all this. So thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, I would like to add, we cannot do this alone. We have to work with other center of excellence and everyone on this. That's why we are part of the many people who are trying to solve the problems. Yeah.
Toby, I'd like to come back to you. The IMO is considering a range of long-term zero carbon fuel solutions. So how do you perceive the nuclear power vessel to fit in a line with this scheme of things? And can you also share your thoughts on the Fit for 55 package, please?
Okay, sure. I mean, I think this is a great question, because really we see that the shipping industry is facing something of a fork in the road up ahead. I mean, it's facing several forks in the road, really, but it's certainly in the near to midterm. I mean, either it can just, comply with the new rules that it's going to face. It can begrudgingly pay 3 times as much for a range of synthetic fuels that will give it basically a third of the energy density that it needs. Or it can reinvent itself. It can take this densest form of energy on the planet that's available, harness it in a safe manner, and do everything better. It can sail its ships faster, at the same time whilst they carry more cargo. And when these vessels arrive in ports, they can, the berths and the ports that they call at, they can actually provide clean electricity in reverse to those ports and harbours, which really changes shipping sort of relationship with these coastal communities, I think, in many ways. And it also, you can then see this concept of some greening of the supply chain. For example, a large container ship arriving at its berth could provide the power that is needed to move the gantry cranes that unload and unload it. Or in the case of a dry cargo vessel, the vessel could provide the power to the conveyor unloading and the grabs and the unloading systems for the dry bulk commodities. And all these bits of equipment are very energy hungry in their own right, and they're now sort of being turned green, if you like, for want of a better phrase, thanks to this molten salt reactor and the atomic technology on board the ship. So it really is potentially quite disruptive. And of course, it needs to say that zero emissions in this come fitted as standard. It's not something that is an add-on extra that's nice to have. That's at the heart of it. And in fact, they're true zero ships. They're not net zero. They don't emit anything at all. I mean, if you take, we're recently involved in a project for a Newcastle Max bulk carrier, so that's about 200,000 deadweight. We're considering that it will be able to sail 2.7 million nautical miles on its one and only fuel load. It'll be able to do that for 25 years, possibly extendable to 30, and carry 3 to 3.5% more cargo on each voyage, which may not sound like a lot, or it may not sound like a headline figure, but if you compound that over time, that really is quite a competitive situation potentially for shipping. Now, not all vessels will be suitable for atomic electric powering. I think I mentioned that at the start. We're considering that it's about 100,000 vessels out there that are responsible for this billion tons of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere. But a bizarrely small proportion of those are responsible for a large amount of the emissions. There's probably something like 7,300 large ships, which actually put out something close to 50% of all the greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. Now, those sort of, the very large ore carriers, the LCCs, the biggest container ships, and certain tonnage from the oil and gas sector, the large tonnage from the offshore sector. Now, if we can target just those ships, we'll be making a huge difference, really, to shipping emissions going forward. But whereas those ships are suitable for atomic electric systems, the vast numbers of smaller vessels will be suitable for these synthetic fuels that Mr. Koh's been outlining. And actually, nuclear-powered production systems can be one method whereby those fuels are produced in the future. We're considering two concepts. One is atomic electric ships that are propelled by a reactor and a power conversion system. But an entirely separate concept is to have a floating production system for green fuels powered by molten salt reactors. Now, these probably wouldn't be able to run we wouldn't be able to give these units the same 30-year life cycle. You'd need to have, the reactor itself would be the same, but you would have a greater number of heat exchangers and larger heat exchangers to extract more power from the reactor. Because remember, a nuclear reactor's job is only really to produce heat. That heat thermal heat needs to be converted by a power conversion system, a steam turbine or a supercritical CO2 turbine, into electrical energy that's then used for other purposes. So by fitting, say, 4 of these molten salt reactors, something like that, onto a green FPSO type arrangement, we think we could probably produce between 1 and 1.5 million tons of green ammonia per year, which is quite a substantial amount from one small unit. I think if you were to kind of try and do that with an offshore wind farm, it would take up the size of a small country potentially. And we agree with, certainly agree with Mr. Koh's comments about ammonia. We're looking very closely at ammonia as well, because when you site an ammonia production facility on one of these offshore platforms, you really don't need any external feedstocks. You can take seawater and desalinate it, and nitrogen from the air to produce ammonia. You could go one step further to produce methanol offshore, but you then need a source of carbon to add into the mix, which is a slight extra complication. So making ammonia is actually a relatively, I wouldn't say simple process, but it's a chemical process that's well known, and it wouldn't be a huge leap to have that sited on a green type FPSO. So really, nuclear power can sort of service the two sides of the equation. For the large ships, it can be an atomic electric propulsion system, and for the smaller vessels, it can very economically produce large amounts of these green synthetic fuels. Because really, at the end of the day, it's the cost of your clean electricity that's the determining factor when it comes to producing these hydrogen derived fuels. So that's really how we see nuclear power playing its role at sea going forward.
Thank you, Tony.
And then you mentioned about the Fit for 55 package. Now, it's not something that I profess to know a huge amount about. I've not studied it in detail, but I know that it's part of the EU Commission's plans to reduce EU greenhouse gases by 55% by 2030. And I mean those are quite ambitious, steep cuts. So quite drastic action will be required, I think, across the sort of whole spectrum of stakeholders if they're going to make progress in doing that. I mean, in 2019, I think EU emissions from shipping was some 135 million tons. and transport as a whole accounted for about a quarter of the EU emissions. So it's a very significant challenge ahead. The main vehicle, I think, by which the EU are going to achieve this Fit for 55 goal is the emissions trading scheme, and this will apply to, it's going to be phased in. I think it will start, the phase in for shipping is proposed to start from 2023 onwards and complete around 2026. And it will apply to all vessels over, I think, 5,000 gross tons. So it's, it's quite, it's going to be another headache for ship owners, basically, especially when you consider that there is a risk that shipping companies may actually start to have to comply with multiple emissions trading schemes if the UK decides to implement its own one, if the US decides to implement its own one, possibly China even in the future, and then there's IMO regulations on top of that. So, we've got these sort of whole suite of cap and trade mechanisms that might be coming, and really the risk seems to be compounded when you have when you sort of put in the background to that this concept of green investing and ESG investing linked to these green financing arrangements. There'll be a responsibility for each ship owner to comply with all relevant environmental legislation, and when you have this whole compound array of cap and trade schemes, it's going to get very complicated and difficult to manage. I mean, I think the excess emissions penalty, I think, has been mooted at 100 euros per ton of CO2, and that could easily go up. And ship owners will need to consider whether there's any advantage in front loading their emissions allowances to sort of take stock of that. I mean, in simple terms, if you're operating a vessel fitted with a molten salt reactor, you're immune to these carbon schemes. And in fact, the vessels themselves will be able to generate carbon credits that you can either use in-house in your own organization or credits that you can then trade in the market. So it just really sort of underpins some of our commercial case really for advanced atomic at sea.
Thank you.
So those are my brief thoughts on it.
Thank you. I'm going to, considering you've brought up the whole question of carbon credits, I'm going to go to Suyin to ask her, do carbon credits have a place in, shipping's future? And how do the carbon credit trading system, how does it work in the maritime industry?
I think that's a really, really good question, and one that is also subject to hot debate within the industry. I think each one of the panelists here today will have their own views on the role that carbon credits has to play. I'll go back to one word, which is strategy. What is a company's strategy for reducing emissions in the short term, mid-term, and long term? Now, my personal view, and I must stress, this is my personal view, is I think carbon credits has a role to play in the present. As technologies develop, both in terms of fuel optimization, vessel optimization, as well as alternate fuels, I think that there is a big question mark over the role that carbon credits have to play in the future for the maritime industry. But pending the development of technologies that can get us to either a net zero or a zero emissions position, we need to find a way where the high carbon emitters, or let's high polluters, can afford to gain credit from the stakeholders within the industry who are not polluting as much. So how do we share the emissions within the industry, if we can put it that way? However, my concern with carbon credits is, where does the money go? Now, I'm not questioning that the money is not going to any good use or something, but putting on a very maritime specific hat, wouldn't it be better if carbon credits being traded by stakeholders within the maritime industry actually goes back towards initiatives or a pot of funds that then contributes or funds innovations in the maritime space to promote decarbonization or emissions? To me, that is a gap right now. I think it's great. You have some initiatives where the money, you can choose what initiative you want your money to go towards. A lot of times it's towards, planting a forest somewhere in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in South America. I think that's great, but why not use it where the industry really needs it? And that's in innovation and development. And that is what could actually potentially incentivize co-creation, collaboration, and co-development of technologies in the industry in the short term and drive a mindset shift when it comes to innovations. So that's my view on carbon credits. Yes, it has a role to play short term, hopefully not so much in the long term, but let's find a proper use for the money that gets put into carbon credits to further innovation in this area in maritime.
Thank you. So, going back to innovation, we're seeing that there is a lot of innovation happening in the maritime industry, especially with regard to technology. There is also a willingness to make these investments. And, there are the fuels, as we have seen, to support decarbonization of the maritime sector. So what are the incentives that the industry is waiting for? Or what are the incentives that we can give them to kind of quicken this process and, make it happen?
Yeah, I think, the industry, speak to any startup and they'll shake their head and they'll tell you, my God, this industry is slow to move. No one wants to be the first one to, put a step forward or test a new technology. So I'll say, I look at it two ways. One is internally within the organization and one is the external environment. Both sides start with a mindset shift. Internally within an organization, we need leaders to start recognizing, as I mentioned below, that having an actionable sustainability policy, which includes decarbonization, is inherently linked to having a valid license to operate. And why is that? Because an actionable sustainable policy covers not only decarbonization, it's linked very closely to issues like the environment, to diversity, to modern day slavery. Why is all this important? It's important because these are issues which your investors, your regulators, and I would say this very important stakeholder that always gets ignored or forgotten, your talent. Your younger generation of employees, those entering the workforce now, are very concerned with what a company's position is in the sustainability space. So as leaders, we need to look upon this not only as, oh my God, these are regulations that are being imposed on me, these are additional costs that are being imposed on me. Of course, that's important, but it's linked to our license to operate. Once that mindset shift occurs, I think the incentive or the internal incentive to try to do things a bit differently, to tackle the sustainability issues that we face, will start gaining traction. If it doesn't, it's going to be really difficult for companies to hire next generation of talent. I can give an example. My niece, who is just graduating this year, was offered a really, really well-paying investment banking role in Canada, and she refused the role. And I said, why did you refuse the role? And she said, well, I look at senior management and there are no females there. I'm like, wow. I said, did you have a chat with them about it? So I know we're not talking about diversity now, but I'm using this as an example. The younger generation, whether you call them the strawberry generation, not the millennials anymore, but when they enter a workforce, particularly if we're trying to entice talent to enter industries that historically had a very bad name in the polluting space, we need to tell them why this is changing, why they can make a difference by entering this industry. And it would then be inherent for companies to weave into their narrative the steps that they are taking in order to make a change in this direction. And I think secondly, at the macro level or the external level, I can touch on it briefly because Michelle and In Kyung have spoken about it ad nauseum, which is creating an environment, an external environment where there are platforms that enable co-creation, co-investment, having centers like the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization, leading thought leadership in this space, and then also giving corporates the opportunity to come forward to test fast, trial fast, fail fast, and keep innovating till we find that long-term solution. What is sorely missing in this industry is collaboration and transparency in terms of what parties, what people are thinking about what to do next. Because we historically tend to view all such information as our competitive advantage. So that mindset shift needs to happen, and we need to see a lot more collaboration in the industry. Third point, if I can, is just systems, because it's another pain point when startups try to sell new ideas or technologies to the maritime industry, which is the most common feedback is, oh, your system will not be compatible or be able to integrate with the system that we currently use now, which is usually a very ancient form of Microsoft or SAP. So in this regard, it's changing this mindset to say, well, yes, we might have system integration problems, but we can overcome that, whether it's through APIs or we can problem solve it. So it's taking the industry along on this tech journey to provide for system integration as well as stakeholder integration along the way. I think those will provide the incentives.
Lovely. Thank you, Suin. Shreyas, may I come to you to say, what would climate conscious drafting of charter parties and related contracts mean?
In my last remarks, I had stopped by mentioning the charter, which is the Sea Cargo Charter. And for example, that presents a draft which is available for all signatories to incorporate as a standard clause within the charter parties, requiring vessel owners to provide fuel emission reports after they complete each voyage. And this would then enable the charterer to calculate, monitor, report their own alignment and decarbonization targets. So basically, it's all about reporting and transparency, and then competing on alignment with climate targets as an additional form, not just on price and quality. Now, the charter presents parties within the charter party chain a contractual approach to at least incentivizing decarbonization, and hopefully it can be fit in with the existing systems fairly easily. Other possible ways could be to look at the ways in which contracts for sale and purchase of goods carried on board or vessel financing and insurance cover are also addressed with climate conscious clauses. There are also operational efficiency indicators, such as the energy efficiency operational indicator to calculate fuel efficiency, amongst other requirements. And there's also the ship energy efficiency management plan. And all of these, and I'm sure there may be new standards as well that will evolve. And so there is therefore wide scope for both owners and charterers to consider provisions addressing technical operational efficiency within riders, and in particular general clauses addressing vessel fuel efficiency. So there is, in the wider context of international trade by sea, there are drafting options opening up to contracting parties. And for example, as a further example, sale contracts that include chartering obligations may consider ways in which reporting requirements can be extended beyond the chartering chain to provide traders with increased visibility of the carbon intensity of their own operations. Traders may also wish to consider how technical and operational efficiencies, such as reduced steaming speeds, might be incorporated within shipping schedules, their sale contracts, especially where cargoes are non-perishable in nature. So keeping this in mind, there is the IMO has also proposed introducing vessel ratings, that is the energy efficiency existing ship index and the annual carbon intensity indicator. I'll pause there by saying that there are several options that are opening up to look at climate conscious.
Do you, Shreyas, see ultimately countries coming together to put together policies to ensure that they are then able to comply on some basic standards and kind of meet their COP26 targets?
I would rather, personally speaking, put my faith in private industry and enterprise than in states agreeing upon anything. We've seen the challenges of the states agreeing even on declarations, differences between the whole language, whether it should be wound down or wound out. And so the agreement among states is, I think, exceedingly challenging, although that would be the ideal situation. But I think states have done what they can, and now it's really up to industry and all actors to say, this is not my problem, and stop changing that mindset to adopting this as their problem. So lawyers, accounting firms, somebody might ask, what have we got to do with climate change or the maritime problem of decarbonization? But the point is that it's everybody's problem. And so greater ownership by the private sector, by all sections of industry, is the way forward, rather than looking to states constantly.
Thank you. Michelle, I'd like to come back to you to say, what are the outcomes? What does the shipping industry have to expect?
Yeah, so maybe just picking up on three themes or three things I think that we've heard from the panel today, and which I think we can probably expect to see more of going forward. So I think the first obvious one is innovation. So we've heard a lot today about innovation going on in all parts of the value chain by large companies, small startups, etc. And I think we can certainly expect to see more of that going forward. I think the question is whether we need something to help spur innovation on, in a sense, and this comes back to the question about market-based measures. And it's something we didn't hear a lot about at COP, but has been talked about in the industry for some time. So I wonder if the second thing we might see more of going forward is those forms of market-based measures. And whether there's different views on the right form of those. Are they taxes? Are they levies? Are they emissions trading scheme? Or where do the revenues of those go? So I think we probably can expect to see more discussion of that. As Toby mentioned, in Europe, we will have the European emissions trading scheme. So that will already be in place, as Toby said, for 2023 for maritime. But it does raise questions about whether that's the right way to do it, or whether we need something done more at a global level, say by the IMO, to maybe help with the potential uneven playing field or the issues that having multiple emissions trading schemes could create. So perhaps a renewed impetus for the kind of market-based measures on more of a global stage. I think the third thing goes to kind of what Shreyas was saying just now. So there's a lot of initiatives. There's kind of this patchwork of declarations, commitments by different countries coming together, industry, etc. But not really, more wide-ranging strategies at the moment. And so will there be pressure? Is the IMO next, greenhouse gas strategy in 2023 the right way to do that? Should we rely on kind of these more patchwork approach to declarations and commitments to get us there? And overall, regardless of whether it's kind of more at a global strategy level or more, I would guess, more of this patchwork approach, there's probably going to be much more ambition and tangible action, I would expect. I think, Shreyas raised the good points of maybe less ambition, but more realistic. And I think that's a good question. And probably one we could debate for a long time, but I do expect to see more ambition. Whether it's all realistic and whether it's all going to come to fruition is probably one we can wait to see on.
Lovely. I'd like to now throw the stage open for any questions from our participants. If you can either raise your hand or put it down in the question box, our panelists will be happy to answer them. Okay, so in case we don't have questions, may I request each of the panelists to take a minute to give their closing remarks before we end the session? Can we start with maybe Mr. Ko? Would you like to start?
Okay. I'm very intrigued at what Subing said just now about, was it something about the younger generations? I'm trying to kind of take in also what Michelle said about ambitions. I want to bring it something closer to myself and to each and individual of us. It's about our children and our next generations. Because we are talking about things that is very basic: the air, energy, water, climate change affect everything. So from that perspectives, I feel that when we think about the problem, shipping has an angle of out of sight, out of mind. We don't see them, but they're also very basic. Energy, we don't see them, but they're very basic. So from that perspective, I feel that when we do our work, we need to rope in the younger people to make them understand that we are trying to address a very big problem, which will not just span across the entire value chain, a lot of stakeholders, it will also span across generations. Because by the time we're talking about 2050, I think at least for me, I'll be retired. We're talking about passing the baton to our kids and to their kids. So from that perspective, I hope that this realization will give us a bit more sense and urgency to say that, hey, if you don't do now, our children will suffer. So I think I'll end with that. That's in a way, that's what drives me to actually work passionately in these sectors. Thank you.
Lovely. That's so true. We really have to look at what we are leaving for the next generation. Toby, would you like to go next?
Sure, Kamala, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what I can only really talk about what we're doing as a company and our experience with that relating to the decarbonisation challenge. And what I'd say is that, you know, nuclear powered ships are not new. They've been operating since 1954 around the world in specialised areas and in the naval world. And molten salt reactors are in fact not entirely new. There was one that ran very successfully in the 1960s before it was shut down over funding issues and political decisions. But putting those two things together and getting the infrastructure for their deployment ready is a new thing. And that is what our aim and focus is. And really, at Core Power, we sort of see ourselves as a focal point or a lens, if you like, between the shipping industry and the nuclear industry. And the job of us as a lens is to throw certain things into focus at the right time for the right people. And it came up in the Q&A that we got, that I got, was that, and it's important, I think, to recognise that nuclear has a poor public image, which is it really is been a victim of its own problem in that sense. It's allowed public opinion to form a negative viewpoint because it's really done very little over the years to try and combat that. It hasn't needed to. It's been generally a public sector utility providing electricity to the grid. Now things are changing. People can see the benefits of small modular reactors, and this was very much at the forefront in COP26 as well. So I think the one thing I'd like to just end on is a public perception point, is that no one has been killed or harmed by radiation from a nuclear reactor since 1986, yet 8 million people a year are dying from air pollution, largely due to fossil fuels. And that's something that I'd really like the public and the industry to try and get their heads around as quickly as possible. That's all.
Thank you. We have a question here which says, what type of vessels are not suited for nuclear energy?
Well, it largely depends on size and power requirements. I mean, in actual fact, a molten salt reactor could fit in anything really from sort of a Panamax and above, let's say, in terms of size. The molten salt reactor will run in a sweet spot from about 20 megawatt electrical power output and upwards, up to about 80. But we're also looking at the moment and evaluating a slightly smaller fission battery type reactor, which would occupy that smaller space, say between 5 to 7, 8 megawatt electric. So actually, to be honest, there's not many ships that wouldn't be entirely suitable, but it does depend a little bit on three things: the power requirement for the vessel, the space available inside that hull, the engine room for the engine room and power conversion systems, and the vessel's operating profile. That has a bearing on it as well.
Lovely. Mr. Ko, I think there's one last question for you, which says, how early can we see alternative fuels being available? And can ship trade worldwide as a particular ship will use a particular fuel type, and getting the fuel worldwide could be a challenge?
The short answer, there are fuels available today that has a lower carbon footprint. So we're talking about LNG here. We're talking about drop-in biofuels. So reality is fuel need energy converter. So we need to rely on present day infrastructure, supply chain, and technology. So you're talking about that, I say, yes, you can. Very green fuels are available today, but having said that, the caveat is that it will come at a higher price point because of the supply and demand issue. Okay, thank you.
Shreyas, last words.
No, I think Enkyang has put it so eloquently, and I think that moral imperative can't be lost on any of us. So I think I just reiterate that this is about rebalancing something that's gone wrong very badly intergenerationally, and so the imperative has to be shared by everybody. Thank you, Enkyang, for putting it so well.
Michelle?
Yeah, no, just to say, I mean, obviously, we work on helping companies and policymakers use economics to answer questions. And I think this certainly raises a number of complex problems, but I think also therefore an opportunity for some really innovative solutions. And hopefully we've heard some of those today, and hopefully, more people can come together in the industry to really think about how we achieve those goals that, Mr. Cohen and Shreyas were just mentioning, to ensure we're setting up the future properly.
Thank you. Finally, Suyin.
Thanks, Kamala. I think everyone has set everything out quite eloquently. I think I'll start by saying that I like to believe that the why we have to do this is not lost on the industry and industry participants. I like to believe that everyone knows why we have to do this. I think where people get lost on is on the what and the how. On this, I'll say no one company is too small, no one person is too insignificant to contribute to this problem. So if you truly believe that this is a problem, then start by being the change. And you can be the change. It's not just about new technology. You can start by investing in people, investing in your people, understanding what are the skill sets necessary for a decarbonization, net zero or zero emission future. Understand who will get value from such a future or from new platforms that you're investing in. Identify those platforms. Start upskilling your crew members, because if we move towards autonomous vessels or fuels of the future, for example, Toby mentioned nuclear has got a bad perception, bad name, maybe unduly so. Start educating them and upskilling the people who are at the coalface, and also building up onshore and IT capabilities. Everyone can do a part now in the short term to set us up for success in the midterm and long term. So be the change is what I will say.
Fantastic. And on that note, let's all hope that the industry takes notice and they all work towards being the change that they want to see around them. Thank you all very, very much. I'd like to thank SCMA, Oxera, Aarna Law, Simha Law, and Baltic Exchange for this amazing event. And I do hope that we can all try to make that little bit of difference to ensure that we leave a better planet for our kids. Thank you very much.